I'm being distracted, so they're going to make me.
No, that's quite all right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The view here is good. I can see you. I can hear you. It's coming in great. So awesome.
Matt's a pro with the technical.
Great headroom, good backgrounds. You've got people who know.
Yes, they've done this once or twice. They know how to make me look good despite my best efforts.
Okay. Well, would you just give a quick start to say who you are and your role, and just briefly what you do as your job?
Absolutely. So Ken Pimlott, I'm the director of CALFIRE, so the chief of CALFIRE, which also includes being California's state forester. So in California, that means we have responsibility for about 31 million acres of forest and watershed lands throughout California. These are essentially unincorporated wildlands. It can be timberlands, forest covered, chaparral, brush covered, or grass and oak woodlands. They're essentially areas that the state identified decades ago as lands that needed to be, they're all almost entirely private, but they needed to be engaged as the broader public trust, and that many of these areas are watersheds that provide runoff for water, provide wildlife habitat, timber resource, both for ecological purposes and certainly for economic from the timber and other values that come from it. So the state invested early on in its state forestry and fire protection organization to protect and help small landowners and larger commercial landowners manage these lands for perpetuity. And the role has evolved over the decades because with 39 million people in California, there's a significant risk, like there is throughout much of the West, but there's certainly a significant risk in California to these lands being damaged or destroyed from wildland fire. And again, with 39 million people, many of them who probably 30 or 40 years ago really began a significant migration from populated areas out into what's now the urban wildland interface or intermix. So many of the wildland areas of the state are also host to rural populations, and so those are not only an ignition source, but also create a protection challenge, and that there's infrastructure and people, houses, et cetera, that are at risk from wildland fires impacting that. So the state invested heavily in CALFIRE, which is what we're called for short, in our wildland fire protection missions. So we bring forward a very strong mixed set of resources from probably the world's largest single fleet of aviation firefighting resources, so air tankers, retardant, helicopters, and other aviation assets. Also, hand crews. We have a program with our Department of Corrections where we have almost 200 inmate firefighting hand crews, along with some others with the California Conservation Corps, staged throughout the state that sort of provide that foot soldier portion of the response. They do a lot of the cutting of hand lines and things in response to not only the fires, but doing fuels treatment and supporting prescribed fire. And then just the mainstay of our response piece, but our fire engines. We have over 300, and we have 343 frontline fire engines staged throughout California that at this time, as we go now, almost into July, we're staffed at peak. So every one of our, hang on, lost my, there is, and I just, hang on a sec, Haley.
Take your time. And if we happen to cut out or something, or if you cut out, just click on the link again, and
okay,
it'll stay up, whether it's me who pops out or you.
And you can hear okay, right?
Yes, I can hear great.
Okay, perfect. So that's it. So that's sort of the frontline. 90% of the department's budget is centered around these fire protection resources, incident management teams, all these things designed to mitigate both initial attack on small fires, but also responding to and dealing with the larger fires when they escape that initial attack. And our goal is 95% of the fires that start in these state responsibility area lands, and that they're contained at 10 acres or less. And we meet that goal. And in some years, like the last 3 or 4 years, it's taken a significant augmentation in the department's resources to do that. Our workload in terms of number of fires around the state has significantly increased. in the last several years due to drought, due to the changing climate. And we're really acknowledging a year-round fire season in many areas because it's just, for example, I think it was 2013 or 2014, we had over 350 acre fire burning in Humboldt County, which is probably one of the wettest places in the state, certainly here. And it was burning actively in January. And so we're recognizing things are changing, and the state's responding to provide the resources to do that. But that's not the only role of the department. It's not the only role of CAL FIRE. Our mission includes, resource management throughout these 31 million acres of lands that we are responsible to assist landowners with reforestation. Land ownership base is anything from small 5-acre forest land parcels all the way up to large timberland owners, 10,000 acres or 100,000 acres. So we have this vast array of ownerships, and we not only regulate timber harvesting. So if you're going to harvest timber on that private land, it requires a timber harvest plan and a variety of steps to comply with the rules to harvest timber in an appropriate way. But also we're responsible for working with small and other landowners to provide for technical services, reforestation, thinning. We have some incentive programs that help small landowners achieve their goals for working forests. Urban and community forestry, we are engaged throughout our urban areas in the state, putting millions of dollars on the ground, not only federal urban and community forestry dollars, but the state is invested in cap and trade funding through our efforts for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. We're actually investing funds that have been invested in through the cap and trade program in forestry, and much of that's going out into our urban setting to plant trees and work with communities on managing urban forests. So the department has a very broad role in resource protection, not only from fire response, but working with landowners in engaging in forest management. One of our biggest challenges, not just with the fire threat, but our forests are overstocked. Again, with fire exclusion in the last 100 years, we've been actively suppressing fires to protect infrastructure. It's also meant an unnatural buildup of fuel and forest stands. And so with that has come significant overstocking, leading to unhealthy forests, and not only a fire threat, but a threat from insect and disease. We are currently dealing with an unprecedented epidemic of bark beetle, in particular the western pine beetle, but others. It's over 102 million trees have succumbed to this epidemic bark beetle attack in the last 6 or 7 years, resulting in thousands of acres of dead forest, not only putting communities in peril and infrastructure, but obviously converting our forest stands, and particularly at the central and southern Sierra, away from mixed conifer now to a regeneration of brush and invasive species, other more fire-prone species. And so many of our central and southern Sierra forests are at risk of going away and being converted to other things. And so a lot of effort. There's a governor's mandated task force of over 80 organizations working together, led by CAL FIRE and our governor's office, to engage, providing tools and resources and support to the counties and to others as we engage in trying to help mitigate the impacts of this. So again, very broad role, but also a very stakeholder-driven role. We are just one partner with many others, and certainly the U.S. Forest Service Region 5 here in California is a very large partner, 18 national forests in California, and they are, again, about a third of the land base in the state is in federal ownership, primarily our national forests and national parks, and to some extent military reservations. So very strong partners there, and engaging and using a variety of different tools to work together. So I know that was a lot right there. I don't know.
No, that gives me a great view of everything. You touched on so many different things that I want to unpack a little bit. Okay. One of the first things is to do with fire exclusion, and particularly sort of like that. So particularly, I wanted you to speak to maybe the public misconception of fires, and what you would have. So I mean, because this is our voice for this video, to really tell people what you would want them to know, as far as, you know, because there is this idea, you know, fire equals bad, for even people who I would think would be sort of in the know, um, don't quite have it, actually. So really, my question would be, could you speak to some of those misconceptions that the public might have, and what would you hope that they could be changed to?
Absolutely. So as we talked about, you know, California has over 39 million people in the state now, and perception of fire since Smokey Bear, you know, for decades has been, you know, we need to actively suppress fires. Fire is bad. And in many instances, it certainly is. And again, with people living in these communities out in the wildland urban interface, fire absolutely is bad. And having a strong policy in the areas that CALFIRE is responsible for, our state responsibility areas, is critical. And we will always have a strong, and need to have a strong ability to actively suppress fires to protect people, property, and resources. But while doing that, that works against our mission to put more fire on the ground to try to mimic the natural conditions where fire occurred naturally in our forests and wildlands prior to the large settlement that we have now, or the urbanization. And so, number one, public messaging of all of this is a challenge, because on one hand, we're telling people absolutely be careful with fire. It's dangerous. But, you know, one less spark means one less fire. If you're out, you know, driving in the wildlands and you're pulling your boat and your chain drags and creates a spark, I mean, those are all things we don't want to have happen. But at the same time, we need to be using fire under the right conditions to mimic what used to occur naturally. And there are so many places in California, whether it's on public land or it's on private land, that we can use fire to our advantage. And so we're really working hard to break down the misconception and the public feeling that all fire is bad. And we're doing that in a number of ways. Obviously, just in general public education through public service announcements and taking advantage of opportunities to showcase what we're doing on the ground. But truth is in actions and not just in words. And so we can talk about this every day, but we actually have to get out on the ground and do more of this and increase our pace and scale to really start to get the social license to demonstrate that it can be done, and it can be done safely and effectively, to really get public and quite frankly, political and social support behind doing it. And none of this takes away from our need to continue to respond and our public safety message. But at the same time, for example, right now here in California, some of our municipalities are burning some critical areas along the American River in Sacramento that are traditionally fire corridors, right in the middle of in the fire season. We're also putting on burns in the Sierra foothills under conditions that meet the prescription. It's a perfect opportunity that with the winds, the temperatures, the humidities are all within an appropriate prescription. And so while we're doing these burns, we're taking advantage of that opportunity to bring people out, to educate the public that yes, while we have wildfires burning and we're suppressing those because where they're burning is bad, at the same time we have the resources and the ability and the right conditions to put more fire on purpose on the ground in other areas and take advantage of that. And I think it's just a matter, we have to get more done, put more smoke in the air on our terms, and get people more and more comfortable with this. So it doesn't come easy. It comes with some risk. We all have to take some risk and be willing to do that. But the way that makes it work, and why it's really starting to turn, is that we're taking the risk together. It's not just CALFIRE, it's not just the Forest Service. We're doing this with our partners, the Nature Conservancy, the various prescribed fire councils around California and around the West. We're all in this together. Many tribal communities. There are many cultural reasons for burning, whether it's for food production or ceremonial reasons. And we've been engaging with our tribal communities here in California for some very small burns, but they have very big impact on the tribal communities to meet their needs and their historical and cultural needs that they have. And so it's partnering, and so there's strength in numbers. And so when the public may not always listen to a government agency or trust a government agency, there are many other organizations that they do listen to and they trust stronger. And so using all of the different organizations as the voice, but it really comes down to being willing to take some risk and collaborate together and get some work done on the ground. And I'm certainly proud of what we're doing in California. CALFIRE historically used to engage in much more of these activities. We haven't in the past several decades. And just recently, within the last year, we are really redirecting our focus and priority to working with our partners and getting more acres burned on the ground, and starting to show some effects. The other area that we're really starting to work on is demonstrating the difference between the impacts of a mega fire, and like the Rim Fire in Yosemite in 2013, or the King Fire in 2014 just west of Lake Tahoe. Those were fires that emitted so many millions of tons of particulate matter in a very intense fire that consumed, in many cases, 100% of the vegetation and just decimated watersheds. Versus the same kind of a fire under controlled terms at a different time of the year, under a prescription, can have an effect of reducing intensity with emissions that are significantly smaller. And so what we try to do is educate that a small burn, low intensity now with minimal emissions, can prevent a mega fire with exponential emissions that not only impact the local area, but the smoke columns and the air quality and the particulate from these large fires, they go many states over. Our fires in California will drift into Nevada, Idaho, and even Montana sometimes. And so that's how devastating, how large they are. And so educating the difference between those kinds of fires versus a prescribed fire under our prescription and control can make a significant impact in reducing emissions, reducing carbon emissions, and quite frankly, obviously, protecting the forest and watershed resource and protecting public safety and less risk for firefighters and the public.
Well, I've been, able to see the effects of seeing controlled burns, prescribed burning. So I think for this video, that is something that we're definitely will visually show that. So we'll go to I think we're going to go to where the King Fire happened.
Okay.
And go to that site, because we're going to go and try and hit some of the biggies, but also see a prescribed burn as it's happening at some point this summer, because we're doing a big loop in the West.
Okay.
So I think that's a great idea. So we'll see what it looks like afterwards, what a prescribed burn looks like, and go to a wildfire. So that's, yeah. And is there anything visually that you think would be, I'm just trying to tell the story through these images that, that I think would match what you're saying.
Right. Well, so if you go, if you're going to be
the before and after, because a prescribed forest being burned looks amazing and beautiful, and you want to walk there.
Exactly.
And it doesn't.
Yeah, I think it's visually. If you go to the King Fire, it's still very raw in many places. It's still very evident the intensity with which that fire burned. So I think just walking out there in the middle of where it burned, you get a visual for a mega fire. And in that fire on one afternoon, it moved about 15 miles to the east, and that was the day that we all were concerned that was actually going to crest the Sierra and go into Lake Tahoe. And there's pictures of that fire from Lake Tahoe Basin looking to the west, and it was like literally a nuclear holocaust was probably the best description I can have there, because it was a plume cloud from this fire was just unreal. It was unlike anything I think up close that any of us would have seen before. And the fact that it was at a place like Lake Tahoe that everybody knows. So I think the images around that fire, both while it was occurring, as B-roll, if you will, but certainly going out on the ground even now and seeing just the skeletons that are out there. And then conversely, being able to go out to, and we can get you to some recently completed prescribed burns that show a very similar kind of forest environment with a lower intensity understory burn, and other kinds of activities, both either around communities or out in the forest itself, with the ability of, to see the difference in intensity.
Great.
Oh yeah, and another good example of what happens in a fire like the King Fire. I know there were lots of things that happened with the Rim Fire as well, but in the King Fire there was a triathlon. I guess the Iron Mountain triathlon Ironman. It's an Ironman. Basically, it's a Ironman triathlon that goes on every year in the basin. They actually had to cancel it, and they literally didn't want to, but they canceled it the morning that it was supposed to start because the air quality became so poor. They didn't feel that the runners and swimmers, cyclists would be able to manage that. Plus, there was still concern about would the fire ultimately come into the Lake Tahoe Basin. So it's got these mega fires have huge social impacts, not only from health, but just from, I mean, these Ironman, particularly that one, and again, Lake Tahoe, just like Yosemite during the Rim Fire, these are high-profile areas, and they get a lot of attention. And so the impact of these fires, so there are a lot of good background pieces to the multiple facets of impact that these fires have, both environmentally, ecologically, and socially, is huge. But I do think the contrast going out on the ground to the other projects that we're doing, looking at some recent prescribed burns and just contrasting the difference, and then try to articulate, okay, what would happen on a given day if a fire did start in a forest that we had already burned through prescription. Yes, fires are still going to burn. You're going to have undergrowth come back. You're going to have lightning strikes, in the tree canopies during lightning storms. But when they reach the forest floor or when they ignite, they're not going to torch out and have a running crown fire like we would see without a managed forest. They're going to be low intensity fires. They're going to give us the ability to put the fires out before they impact the community. Much easier to work with. So I think if you're standing in a prescribed forest or any that has a prescribed fire occur in it, you'll be able to talk about how a wildfire burning in there afterwards would be impacted. And if you're out on a prescribed burn during the fire, during the burn, I think you can also talk about intensities. It'll be very clear and easy whether it's a forest understory burn or a grass burn or a brush burn in brush fuels. The intensities are different. And so you will be able to contrast what you're seeing while a prescribed fire is going on with, again, showing pictures of these mega fires. And again, the Valley Fire and the Butte Fire in 2015, which were among our most destructive fires in our history, give you a very real contrast. And I think that would just graphically help show, it's one thing to keep saying low intensity versus, disastrous, high intensity, but to actually be able to see it while it's happening and talk about it, I think might be a real good opportunity.
And if you were doing a prescribed burn, potentially in the same area, and where the King Fire was, and it was in a place that was managed, it might be a good story to tell that the Ironman probably wouldn't have had to be canceled. I mean, just because
had we been able to, do much more work in the footprint of the King Fire prior to the fire occurring, the intent that it wouldn't have burned 15 miles in one day. Yeah, I mean, it's still going to burn. There would have been opportunities both for CALFIRE and the Forest Service to find places to contain the fire, different ridge lines, different areas different features that would allow for containment. But that fire, the spotting, is miles sometimes ahead of the main fire. So embers blow in the wind, or the smoke columns that are actually being generated by the fire itself, they carry embers well ahead of the fire. And there's nothing you can do to stop a fire when it spots ahead of itself in multiple places, miles ahead. And yeah, the Iron, and people were very upset about the Ironman being canceled in Tahoe. Had repercussions. People came from all over the world to be there. And yeah, now not only did we impact that, we impacted air quality, we impacted the entire economy of Placer and El Dorado and the surrounding counties. and put lots of firefighters and people at risk as well, because this fire went on for a long time, and there were thousands of firefighters on the fire lines, working to contain that for quite a while.
Let's see here. Talked about exclusion. Okay. Systems. I'm just going to run through my notes. You're doing such an awesome job just hitting all of these things.
People can
ask me. It's like you've done this before or something.
Maybe once or twice.
Let's see. So who is, I guess I would say, what's the biggest factor in starting wildfires? Is it the human interaction or is it natural interaction?
So in California, about 95% of the fires are started by people, approximately, just over 94%. And that's a variety of causes. And some might think, well, is it arson? Well, it's all of the above. Oftentimes, it's something where people are trying to do the right thing. They're just doing it the wrong way. It's mowing, it's weeding to do their defensible space. And they strike a rock, when humidities are low. It's cars pulling off to the side of the road with a hot catalytic converter or their exhaust system, into that dry grass off to the side. We look at causes, all the time to look at ways we can, try to prevent these. It's people weld. The people out working in the wildlands, they're welding, they're grinding, they're doing what they do to run their ranches, and it's all of that. It's the recreation. It can be an escaped campfire. It certainly can be arson, and unfortunately, we've had some very disastrous fires and deadly fires in California in the last few years that were the work of arson, and so we take that very seriously. So we take a multifaceted approach to reducing the human-caused fires, because one could think if 95% of your fires are started by people, that you should be able to find a way to prevent that. I can't stop the lightning fires; those are going to occur. We use as much technology as we can to detect lightning strikes. We monitor weather very closely. Sometimes it changes hourly. Sometimes these lightning storms and these weather patterns can be very unpredictable. In 2008, that occurred where we had over 2,000 fires started within just a few hours, with I believe it was 15 to 20,000 lightning strikes across much of Northern California. There wasn't much we could do about that. We had to just be prepared to respond and triage the fires, and obviously prioritize public safety and infrastructure. But we do utilize all the technology available to us to look at weather patterns. We know when we're going to have what we call bad fire days, days when temperatures are up, humidities are down, and wind. And with all that combination, when that's forecast, we can move resources around the state where our biggest threats are. We can identify additional resources if we need to. We have a system in California that is unlike any other, that can bring resources from local government, from our state agencies like the National Guard and others, as well as obviously the federal firefighting agencies. We can move all those resources around California, not only when the fires are burning, but in advance of, when we know there are going to be the high potential. So we can look at all of those things. But when we come back to the prevention piece, we try to attack that challenge from all facets. Public education is really number one. It's every day working on the message to help educate and get people engaged, that they are a big piece of this equation. It's the deterrence. Certainly, if you start a fire negligently in California, even if it's one of these accidental causes, you can still be held liable for the cost of suppressing that fire. And so it's really trying to use those tools to really get people's attention that fire can be dangerous, particularly in these wild and urban interface areas, and that we've all got to take our part to engage and protect that.
And I have to say, it sounds a whole lot easier to start a fire in California than it does where I live in North Carolina. none of those things are things I would have ever considered, like dragging out. Whoa, they're just, they just are things that it seems like people who live in California have to be more vigilant and smarter about starting fires. in general. Okay, that's not a question. That's just my comment. But
That's very true.
Oh, I wanted to ask you if you were the supreme despot of all fire.
I
And
tell people that, but they don't believe me.
yeah. Me too. I try that with my family. It doesn't work.
It doesn't work, does it?
But if you could say, if the human element was gone and you were able to get the forest back to how you wanted it to be, and then bring everybody back, could you just kind of quickly give me the rundown of what you would do in your fantasy land with every resource that you could have?
Yeah. If we could start from scratch, sort of reset the playing field, and we had our forest conditions and our wildlands in the perfect condition, the most desirable state that was appropriate for wildlife, for forest health. And then we put people back into that. And I would of course, they'd have to be back into the level to be realistic. Let's assume the same levels we're at today. Here's the things that we would need to consider is we would start from the beginning and be educating and recognizing that fire is a part of the landscape in California. So that we need to be thinking that not only do we have to be resistant to fire, in other words, all of our building construction, as we build homes in the wildland, as we design communities, all needs to be in mind that fires are going to burn, whether we like it or not, and that we need to have infrastructure that withstands the impact of fire. So that would be number one. And then also the number two, concurrent with that, is an understanding that our landscapes have to be more resilient to fire. In other words, they're going to have fire. And so how do we continue to, now that we've got our landscape in the perfect state, how do we maintain that? And in order to maintain that, fire is going to be part of the equation. And so getting everybody up to the speed from the beginning to understand there's good fire and there's bad fire, if you will, and that we're going to use fire as a tool to help manage and keep these forests in the desirable state. And I think, again, doing that from the beginning, where we have the opportunity to educate everyone on a level playing field from the beginning, before the biases are start. Again, we recognize we've got to prevent fires, but how do we talk again about preventing the bad fire and maintaining and supporting the good fire for beneficial use?
You make awesome videos.
I think so. And I actually, a lot of people think this is an uphill challenge, and it certainly is a daunting challenge to get the fire back on the landscape. And this, though, we laugh about the video, but absolutely making videos. The more time we spend talking about this and using tools and relating to people at whatever level they're at, it's not a talking down to people, and it's really trying to help people understand in their own environment. And so, oftentimes in our profession, we get very caught up in our own jargon, and we just expect everybody understands what we're talking about. And it's very difficult for people to understand that or relate to it. And the opportunity to have videos or to have venues that people relate to, using different opportunities, different venues. If it's our younger population, what are they relating to right now? What are the cartoons? What are those video games? All those things. So how do we build messages in at those various levels that they will connect with, instead of just, the agency officials or the scientific community continuing to say the same words, knowing that folks are, we're just becoming background noise in many cases.
We need a top 40 song about prescribed burning, and then we're all done. Well, the advantage that you have is that what you do is, and it's really.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Oh, the advantage is that what you do is super cool. I mean, it really is, and it's visually stunning, and I think that's going to play well. I mean, you're right. If there was a video game that was you having to fight fires like this in the same way that you're fighting in World War II on these like amazing, cool looking games. That just gave me goosebumps.
Or what if we gave SpongeBob a drip torch, right? And he,
we like to use SpongeBob fire. I think that's a good thought, but I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old.
Yeah, maybe not.
About SpongeBob levels. No fire is good fire for SpongeBob.
No, that's very true.
And I just wanted to ask really one more thing, and that's if there's anything that I have forgotten to ask, something that you would just, I mean, I think you really answered it really well with talking about what you do if you got to have the whole world knowing what everything is. But if there's anything that I've forgotten to ask that you would like me to know, would like people to know, that I can incorporate for the video.
Yeah, and this is another difficult public message, and it's a bit complex. But as we talk about all of this, there's different abilities and different policies between federal land management organizations like the Forest Service and the National Park Service and BLM, who they own the land. It's public land. They're responsible for it. They are the managers. They can set policy and do things differently. And for example, there's managed fire that it can occur on those lands. In other words, a lightning strike that starts, and if it meets a prescription within an appropriate window and it's in an area that's appropriate, they can allow that fire to burn within certain parameters. Those aren't the luxuries that we have on private land for the most part, because land ownership sizes are different. Infrastructure, people are too much part of the equation in these other areas. So we have to take a much more aggressive role in active suppression in many of these other areas. And so sometimes that shows a little difference in policy. And so from the state's perspective, we have to make up that by putting prescribed fire on the ground. So while we may not necessarily use natural fire and let that burn to reduce the fuel loading or to meet a prescription, we will use prescribed fire, where we actually physically put the fire on the ground at a time of year when we have resources available and we have favorable weather conditions. And so the important piece here that every agency and organization and jurisdiction has governing and guiding policies and social issues and other constraints or issues that drive their mission and how they operate. So it's our challenge is to work together and find ways to work through that. While I may not be able to let fires burn, I can increase the pace and scale to put other fire on the ground under our terms. But certainly we can support our federal partners in areas where they're going to use natural fire. So it's how we work together, recognizing our differences, but leveraging the common message that regardless of the source and the tool, fire on the ground is important. And however we get there, we're doing it together.
Fantastic.
That's all I got.
I'm definitely gonna have. That's actually a message that I hadn't thought to put in there. A lot of what I have is all the ecological and biological stuff. So this is great. Yeah,
it's going to be that you may hear that from other states. One of the things that pit the Forest Service against a lot of the states historically has been all their fires burn and they get too big, and there's always going to be some of that tension. And where we're looking at it here in California is that, look, we're all recognizing our differences, and we work really closely to share resources and do things. It's okay that they're going to, in fact, we signed a memorandum of understanding in California on prescribed fire over a year ago. And it recognizes all these differences between the agencies. But the one common thread is that the use of fire, putting more fire on the ground is what we all agree on, and we'll work together to get there. And yes, there's ecological reasons for burning, but there's also fire and fuels reduction reasons for burning. And so it's public safety, it's fuels reduction, it's forest health, and it's ecological restoration. So there's lots of reasons to have more fire and use fire on the ground.
Okay, I know I said that was the last question, but I do have, it's already 5:03. I wanted to ask about water.
Sure.
Just what the forest means to water for you in particular in California.
Forests are critical for water in California. Over 2/3 of the water supply in the state comes from our Sierra Nevada mountains, the snowpack, the runoff, the watersheds, and that feeds not only Central California, but much of Southern California that doesn't have the forest environment to the level that Northern California does. So protection of those watersheds is key. If again, a king fire, a rim fire that denudes 100 or 200,000 acres at high intensity fire, the forest canopy cover is gone, and so that means that there's significant erosion, sedimentation, water temperatures significantly increase in the creeks, the rivers, reservoirs, and other lakes fill with sediment, so our water storage capacity can quickly become significantly less. We lose fishery habitat because water temperatures are up, and again, we lose critical soil as it moves down into the streams and further down and into the lakes. That critical organic layer that supports the regrowth of forests comes off the surface, and so we're left with soil that won't support regeneration of forest plant species. So, but key, water is number one for not only the survival of the people in the state and here in the West, but obviously wildlife and all the things that water provides. And without forests, which collect the water, that's where the water comes from. It starts in the watersheds that are covered in the forest. If that doesn't exist, it significantly impacts water supply and water quality.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I am good to go here. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. And I have this feeling, I'm not really sure, we may see you when we're on the road.
Well, that's what I was just asking. So, Janet, are they coming out? And you're coming out at the end of July, right? August 1st.
And early August. So we're gonna stay in your area, and I think we're gonna jump out to the King Fire area, but we're gonna be in San Francisco area. So I think the idea is to get you in the forest too, if you're willing and able and around. And
absolutely, the King Fire is less than an hour from here, and so yeah, no, my plan is to totally be at everyone's disposal, and would love to get out and have more dialogue on this out there.
Very cool. I know that Sherry and Sarah are taking care of that, so they're probably all
they got me booked up already. Apparently it's on my calendar. So
just another second to say thank you for dedicating your life to do something that is super important for the health of people and the health of our planet. I super appreciate it.
You're welcome. I enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Well, then I'll see you this summer. I can't wait.
You got it.
You'll get to meet my husband, Rob. You'll probably get to meet the whole family. Who knows?
You're gonna bring him on the road? Good.
Yes, we are bringing the whole family on the road.
You'll have fun. It's a good time to be down here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we want them to be as much a part of what we do. I mean, our whole life is making science documentaries, and we're trying to positively impact the world, and we want them to be a part of it as young as possible.
Oh, that's cool. That is really cool.
We like them too. We like them around. Okay.
I would suppose, yeah, for some reason.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. I'll see you very soon.
All right. Take care.
Bye. You too.
Bye.